1931, the Castellammarese War rewrote the entire American underworld in 14 months. By 1930, the Italian-American underworld in New York was controlled by two men who hated each other. Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, led the largest faction, commanding loyalty across Manhattan and Brooklyn through a network of enforcers and earners who had been with him since the Prohibition boom made everyone rich. Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist who had arrived in the United States with ambitions that extended well beyond his initial territory, led the Castellammarese faction, named for the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, from which many of its members originated. Maranzano wanted control. Masseria intended to keep it. The killing began in February 1930. Over the following 14 months, soldiers on both sides were assassinated in a pattern that was relentless but strategically incoherent. Neither faction could deliver a decisive blow. Masseria's forces were larger but poorly coordinated. Maranzano's were disciplined but outnumbered. Bodies appeared in alleys, in parked cars, on the steps of social clubs. Estimates of the total dead during the Castellammarese War range from 30 to over 60, though the actual figure, accounting for disappearances that were never reported and killings in cities beyond New York, was almost certainly higher. The war ended not through military victory but through betrayal from within. Charles Lucky Luciano, Masseria's most capable lieutenant, determined that neither boss was fit to lead what organized crime could become. He arranged a meeting with Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on April 15, 1931. Luciano excused himself to the restroom. Four gunmen, among them believed to be Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, entered and shot Masseria to death. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and reorganized the New York underworld into 5 families. His reign lasted 5 months. On September 10, 1931, 4 men posing as federal agents entered his office at the Helmsley Building in Midtown Manhattan and stabbed and shot him to death. Luciano had arranged both killings. He abolished the title of boss of all bosses and replaced the old power structure with the Commission, a governing body of equal bosses that would manage disputes through negotiation rather than war. The framework he created lasted more than 50 years. The war that made it necessary had killed dozens of men and demonstrated to the survivors that the old way of doing business, one man ruling by force alone, was operationally unsustainable. 2. The Second Mafia War in Sicily killed over 1,000 people in 4 years. The Second Mafia War, fought across Sicily between approximately 1981 and 1983, with aftershocks continuing through 1986, was the most lethal internal conflict in the modern history of organized crime anywhere in the world. The Corleonesi faction, led by Salvatore Totorina and Bernardo Provenzano, launched a systematic campaign to eliminate every rival clan within the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and establish absolute dominance over the island's criminal economy. The killing was not impulsive, it was industrial. Rina had spent years positioning loyalists within rival families, mapping networks of alliance and dependency, and identifying the precise sequence of eliminations that would collapse each opposing faction from the top down. When the war began in earnest, the Corleonesi moved with a speed and a comprehensiveness that left their enemies unable to mount an organized response. Bosses were killed first, their underbosses followed within days. Soldiers who might have rallied resistance were eliminated before they understood the scale of what was happening. Investigators estimated that between 1981 and 1983 alone, more than 1,000 people were killed across Sicily in connection with the war. The dead included not only rival mafiosi but their relatives, their associates, and anyone whose elimination served the Corleonesi objective of total dominance. Entire families were erased from the organizational structure of the Cosa Nostra. Men who had controlled territories for decades vanished in a matter of weeks. The war achieved its objective. Riina emerged as the unchallenged leader of the Sicilian Mafia, a position he held through terror and operational discipline for over a decade. But the scale of the violence produced consequences he had not calculated. The public revulsion generated by the war, compounded by the assassinations of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992, created the political conditions for an unprecedented state response. Riina was arrested on January 15, 1993. Provenzano continued as a fugitive until 2006. The Corleonesi had won the war and lost the peace. So the apparatus of state power that ultimately dismantled their organization was mobilized in significant part by the sheer volume of what they had done. 3. The Boston Irish Mob War killed 60 men and created Whitey Bulger. The Boston Irish Gang War of the 1960s began over something that in retrospect seems almost incomprehensible as a catalyst for sustained killing. A dispute over a woman at a Labor Day party in 1961 escalated into a confrontation between members of two rival Irish-American criminal factions in the Boston area, and within weeks, men were dying. On one side stood the McLaughlin brothers, George, Bernie, and Edward, who controlled criminal operations in the Charlestown neighborhood. On the other stood the McLean-Flemmi faction, led by James Buddy McLean, operating out of Somerville and Winter Hill. The initial provocation was personal, but the war it produced was structural. Both factions had been competing for territory, for control of loan sharking and bookmaking operations across Greater Boston, and the personal dispute provided the ignition for a conflict that had been building for years. Over the following decade, approximately 60 men were killed. The methods were direct and efficient. Men were shot in cars, in bars, on the street. Bodies were found in trunks, in harbors, in vacant lots. The war consumed the leadership of both factions. Buddy McLean was shot and killed in 1966. George McLaughlin was convicted of murder in 1964. Bernie McLaughlin was shot dead on a sidewalk in Charlestown in 1961, the first major casualty of the conflict. The war's most significant consequence was not who it killed, but who it elevated. Howie Winter assumed control of the McLean faction after McLean's death and consolidated the surviving elements into what became known as the Winter Hill Gang. Among the men who rose through the violence was a South Boston enforcer named James Whitey Bulger, who had returned from federal prison in 1965 and positioned himself within the winning faction with a patience and a strategic intelligence that his associates recognized immediately. The war that killed 60 men created the conditions for Bulger's eventual dominance of Boston's criminal underworld, a dominance he would maintain for 2 decades through a corrupt alliance with the FBI that was itself one of the most destructive relationships in American law enforcement history. The Boston Irish Gang War demonstrated a pattern that would repeat itself across organized crime conflicts worldwide. The men who started the killing were not the men who benefited from it. The beneficiaries were the men who survived and who understood that the chaos of war created opportunities for reorganization that peacetime never provided. 4. The Bonanno War split the Bonanno family and exposed it to federal destruction. Joseph Bonanno had led the family bearing his name since its creation by Salvatore Maranzano in 1931. For more than 30 years, he had operated with a degree of autonomy and strategic vision that distinguished him from the other commission bosses. He was an elder statesman of American organized crime, and in 1963 he overreached. Bonanno had allegedly conspired to assassinate 3 fellow commission members, Carlo Gambino, Stefano Magaddino, and Thomas Lucchese, in a bid to consolidate power across multiple families. The plot was exposed. The commission, the body Luciano had created precisely to prevent this kind of unilateral ambition, responded by stripping Bonanno of his authority and ordering him to retire. Bonanno refused. What followed was a prolonged internal conflict within the Bonanno family that lasted from approximately 1964 to 1968 and became known publicly as the Banana War, a name the press applied and that Bonanno himself reportedly detested. The family fractured between loyalists who supported Bonanno's continued leadership and a faction aligned with the Commission's directive, led by Gaspar Di Gregorio and later Paul Siaka. The violence was intermittent but sustained. Shootings, bombings, and disappearances occurred across New York, with soldiers on both sides targeted in a conflict that produced no clear military resolution. Bonanno eventually withdrew to Arizona in 1968, ceding operational control. The family that bore his name was left weakened, divided, and exposed. The Commission, which had already viewed the Bonannos with suspicion, effectively marginalized the family for years. That marginalization created the operational vulnerability that allowed FBI agent Joseph Pistone, operating under the alias Donnie Brasco, to infiltrate the family beginning in 1976, an operation that lasted 6 years and resulted in over 100 convictions. The Bonanno family was ultimately removed from the Commission entirely, the only New York family to suffer that distinction. The war Joseph Bonanno started to expand his power ended by diminishing it permanently. The family he had built over 3 decades was weakened to a point from which it never fully recovered, not because of what its enemies did, but because of the fractures the internal conflict had created. 5. The Profaci-Gallo War turned Brooklyn into a battlefield for 3 years. Joseph Profaci had led the family that would eventually bear the Colombo name since 1928. He was among the original 5 bosses established under the commission system and had maintained control for over 30 years through a combination of political skill and enforced loyalty. He was also, by the assessment of many of his own soldiers, extracting more from his men than any other boss in New York. Profaci required regular tribute payments from his crews beyond the standard distribution of earnings that every family operated under. Soldiers who earned were expected to pay upward in amounts that left them, in their own view, working primarily for the enrichment of a boss who contributed little to their daily operations. The resentment was widespread. The man who acted on it was Larry Gallo, along with his brothers Albert "Kid" Blast Gallo and Joey Gallo, who controlled a crew based in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. The Gallo brothers demanded a larger share of the family's earnings and greater autonomy. Profaci refused. In February 1961, the Gallos kidnapped several of Profaci's top allies, including underboss Joseph Magliocco, in an attempt to force negotiations. Profaci agreed to terms. He did not honor them. Within months, some hit teams were dispatched. The war that followed lasted from 1961 to 1963 and produced at least 9 confirmed deaths, with the actual number almost certainly higher when accounting for disappearances. Larry Gallo survived a strangling attempt at the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn, only because a police officer walked in during the attack. Joey Gallo was imprisoned on extortion charges in 1961 and spent the majority of the war behind bars. Profaci died of cancer in 1962, and the conflict continued under his successor, Joseph Magliocco, and then under Joseph Colombo, who assumed leadership in 1964. The war's operational consequences extended far beyond the body count. It demonstrated that the commission system, designed to prevent exactly this kind of internal conflict, had no effective enforcement mechanism when a boss exploited his own soldiers to the point of revolt. The Gallo faction had legitimate grievances by the standards of the organization's own internal logic. They received no structural remedy. The war they fought in response left the family permanently factional, a division that would resurface repeatedly over the following decades and contribute to making the Colombo family the most internally unstable of the 5 New York families. 6. The French Connection War dismantled a global heroin pipeline through targeted assassination. The French Connection was not a single organization, but a supply chain, a logistical network that moved Turkish opium through processing laboratories in Marseille and into the American market through Corsican intermediaries working with American mafia families, principally the Lucchese and Bonanno organizations. At its peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the French Connection supplied an estimated 80 to 95% of the heroin consumed in the United States. It was the most profitable narcotics pipeline in the world. The war that dismantled it was not fought between rival criminal factions in the conventional sense. It was fought between the Corsican milieu in Marseille and a combination of French, American, and Turkish law enforcement agencies, with internal betrayals and competitive eliminations among the traffickers themselves accelerating the destruction. What made it a war rather than a simple enforcement operation was the systematic use of assassination by competing Corsican groups attempting to control or redirect the pipeline as law enforcement pressure intensified. Between 1971 and 1975, key figures in the network were eliminated through a combination of arrests and killings. Auguste Ricoeur, the Corsican trafficker who had managed distribution through Paraguay, was arrested and extradited to the United States in 1972. Jean-Baptiste Croce, a principal laboratory operator in Marseille, was arrested in 1971. Others were killed by competitors who sought to inherit their positions or by associates who feared they would cooperate with investigators. The French authorities, under pressure from the Nixon administration's declared war on drugs, dismantled the Marseille laboratories through a series of coordinated raids. By 1975, the pipeline that had supplied the vast majority of American heroin for over a decade had effectively ceased to function. The operational vacuum it left was filled within years by Southeast Asian and later South American suppliers, but the specific network, the men, the routes, the processing infrastructure was destroyed. The French Connection War illustrated a principle that applied to every conflict on this list. The destruction of a criminal network did not eliminate the market it served. It redistributed it. The heroin trade continued. The men who had built the most efficient supply chain in its history were dead, imprisoned, or scattered, and the organizations that had depended on their products product adapted, as criminal organizations always do, by finding new suppliers willing to accept the same risks for the same rewards. 7. The Rivonia Avenue massacre ignited a decade of war inside the Colombo family. The Colombo family had never fully healed from the Profaci-Gallo conflict of the early 1960s. The factional lines that war had drawn were suppressed, not erased, and by the late 1980s, the family was again splitting along a fault line that its leadership could not contain. On one side stood acting boss Victor Orina, who had been appointed to manage operations while official boss Carmine Persico served his 139-year sentence. On the other stood the Persico loyalists, who viewed Orina as a temporary custodian who had begun acting as though the position were permanent. Orina wanted the title. The Persico faction intended to ensure he never received it. In June 1991, a team of shooters ambushed Orina outside his girlfriend's home on Long Island. He survived. The war that followed did not observe the restraint that prior Colombo conflicts had at least nominally maintained. Between 1991 and 1993, the Third Colombo War produced 12 confirmed murders and at least 15 attempted killings. Soldiers and associates on both sides were shot in cars, outside homes, in social clubs, and on public streets in Brooklyn and Long Island. The violence was frequent enough and geographically dispersed enough that the FBI designated it an active gang war, requiring dedicated surveillance and response resources. Bystanders were wounded in at least 2 incidents, a development that intensified law enforcement attention beyond what either faction had anticipated. The war ended not through decisive victory but through mass prosecution. Federal authorities, who had been monitoring both factions through wiretaps and informants throughout the conflict, used the war itself as the evidentiary foundation for sweeping RICO indictments. Orina was convicted in 1992 of racketeering and murder conspiracy and sentenced to life. Multiple captains and soldiers on both sides were convicted in subsequent trials. The Persico faction retained nominal control, but the family that emerged from the war was operationally devastated. Its ranks were depleted, its earning capacity diminished, and its reputation within the commission reduced to that of an organization that could not govern itself. The Third Colombo War demonstrated what federal prosecutors had understood since the commission trial of 1986. Mafia wars were no longer simply internal problems for the organizations that fought. They were evidentiary opportunities for the agencies that monitored them. Every act of violence generated witnesses, surveillance material, and cooperating defendants. The war that was supposed to resolve a leadership dispute instead provided the government with the material to dismantle both sides simultaneously. 8. The Philly mob war consumed 3 bosses in a single generation. The Philadelphia crime family had operated for decades under a leadership structure that, while never as stable as the New York families, had maintained a functional continuity sufficient to control the city's gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering operations. That continuity collapsed in the 1980s under the weight of a leadership conflict that killed 3 bosses and effectively destroyed the family as a coherent operational entity. Angelo Bruno had led the Philadelphia family since 1959 with a management philosophy that prioritized stability over expansion. He avoided narcotics, maintained alliances with the New York families, and governed through consensus. On March 21, 1980, he was shot in the back of the head while sitting in his car outside his home in South Philadelphia. The killing had been authorized by his own underboss, Antonio Caponigro, who believed Bruno's conservative approach was costing the family millions in unrealized narcotics revenue. Caponigro had not obtained commission approval for the hit. Within weeks, he and his brother-in-law were found dead in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, their bodies bearing evidence of prolonged torture. The commission had made its position clear. Philip Testa was installed as Bruno's successor. On March 15, 1981, less than a year after taking power, Testa was killed by a nail bomb placed beneath the porch of his home. The bombing was orchestrated by Pete Casella and Rocco Marinucci, acting on behalf of a faction that opposed Testa's leadership. Nicky Scarfo, a volatile and widely feared capo from Atlantic City, assumed control after Testa's death and led the family through a period of internal violence that was extraordinary, even by the standards of organized crime succession disputes. Between 1980 and 1990, more than 30 members and associates of the Philadelphia family were murdered in connection with the ongoing power struggle. Scarfo himself ordered the killings of soldiers who he suspected of disloyalty, creating a climate of paranoia that accelerated the very betrayals he feared. By the time Scarfo was convicted of RICO charges in 1988 and sentenced to 55 years, the Philadelphia family had been reduced to a fraction of its former operational capacity. 3 bosses killed in a decade, dozens of soldiers eliminated, and a membership so diminished and so compromised by cooperating witnesses that the organization's ability to project authority in its own territory was fundamentally impaired. 9. The Camorra Wars in in Naples killed over 3,500 people across 3 decades. The Camorra, the Neapolitan organized crime network, does not operate under the hierarchical commission structure of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra or the American Five Families. It is a constellation of autonomous clans competing for territorial control across the city of Naples and its surrounding provinces. That structural reality has made it, over the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the most consistently violent major organized crime network in Western Europe. The Camorra Wars, a term that encompasses overlapping clan conflicts spanning from the late 1970s through the 2000s, produced an estimated death toll exceeding 3,500. The killing was concentrated in specific periods of intensified conflict. The first major escalation occurred in the early 1980s when Raffaele Cutolo's Nuova Camorra Organizzata waged war against the rival Nuova Famiglia coalition for control of the Neapolitan drug trade, construction rackets, and extortion networks. That conflict alone killed hundreds. Subsequent wars between the Secondigliano Alliance and the Di Lauro clan in 2004 and 2005, known locally as the Scampia feud, brought military-grade violence to public housing complexes in northern Naples. Shootings occurred in daylight on residential streets. Teenagers were recruited as soldiers. The operational discipline that characterized Sicilian or American mafia conflicts was largely absent. The Camorra Wars were fought with a ferocity and a disregard for civilian exposure that reflected the decentralized, competitive nature of the organizations involved. Italian authorities deployed thousands of additional police and carabinieri to the Naples region during the worst periods of violence, and hundreds of Camorra members were arrested and convicted under anti-mafia statutes. But the structural characteristic that made the Camorra so violent, the absence of a central authority capable of imposing order, also made it resilient. No single prosecution could decapitate the network because no single leadership existed to decapitate. Clans were dismantled and replaced by successor clans operating from the same territories within months. The Camorra Wars were not a single conflict with identifiable beginning and end. They were the permanent condition of an organization defined by competition. The violence was not an aberration, it was the system functioning as designed. 10. The 'Ndrangheta's first internal war killed 233 people in a town of 5,000. The first 'Ndrangheta War of San Luca, fought in the Calabrian hill town of San Luca between 1985 and 1991, produced one of the most disproportionate casualty figures in the history of organized crime relative to the size of the community in which it was fought. San Luca's population at the time was approximately 5,000 people. The war killed 233. The conflict originated in a dispute between the Nirta Strangio and Pelle Votari Romeo clans over control of the town's criminal economy, and the symbolic authority that territorial dominance in San Luca carried within the broader 'Ndrangheta network. San Luca held a specific significance in the organizational mythology of the 'Ndrangheta as one of the founding locations of the Calabrian Mafia, and control of the town carried weight that exceeded its economic value. The killing was intimate in a way that distinguished it from the urban warfare of Naples or the targeted assassinations of New York. In a community of 5,000 people, the combatants knew each other personally. They had attended the same schools, the same churches, the same festivals. See, the violence fell along family lines that had been established for generations, and the retaliatory logic of the conflict ensured that every killing produced an obligation for a reciprocal response. Italian authorities struggled to intervene effectively. The community's isolation, both geographical and cultural, made intelligence gathering extraordinarily difficult. The code of silence in San Luca was not merely a criminal convention. It was a social reality reinforced by family bonds that law enforcement could not penetrate through conventional methods. The war eventually subsided through a combination of exhaustion, negotiated settlement between surviving clan leaders, and the imprisonment of key figures on both sides. The violence resurfaced in 2007 when members of the Nirta Strangio clan killed 6 members of the Pelle Votari Romeo faction outside a restaurant in Duisburg, Germany, demonstrating that the San Luca feud had followed the 'Ndrangheta's expansion into northern Europe. The Duisburg massacre was the single deadliest act of organized crime violence on German soil and forced European law enforcement agencies to reassess the operational reach of the Calabrian Mafia. A town of 5,000 people had produced a war that killed 233 of its residents and eventually exported its violence to another continent. The proportional devastation had no parallel in the modern history of organized crime in the Western world. 11. The Sicilian Mafia's assault on the Italian state killed prosecutors, judges, and police for a decade. Between the early 1980s and the early 1990s, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, under the leadership of Salvatore Maranzano and the Corleonesi faction, conducted a sustained campaign of violence against representatives of the Italian state that had no precedent in post-war Western Europe. The campaign was not incidental to the organization's criminal criminal operations. It was a deliberate strategic decision to eliminate the individuals most responsible for prosecuting and investigating the mafia and to intimidate those who might replace them. The targets were specific. General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, the prefect of Palermo, who had previously led Italy's anti-terrorism efforts, was assassinated along with his wife on September 3, 1982. Investigating magistrate Rocco Cinici was killed by a car bomb in Palermo on July 29, 1983. Judge Cesare Terranova had been killed in 1979. Prosecutor Gaetano Costa was assassinated in 1980. The list extended across a decade and included police officials, politicians, and anyone whose professional function brought them into direct conflict with the Corleonese's interests. The culmination came in 1992 with the assassinations of Giovanni Falcone on May 23 and Paolo Borsellino on July 19, both killed by massive explosive devices in operations that required extensive planning, logistics, and resources. The combined death toll of the two bombings, including bodyguards and bystanders, was 10, but the symbolic impact was incalculable. Falcone and Borsellino had been the architects of the Maxi trial of 1986 to 1987, which had convicted 338 members of the Sicilian Mafia and represented the most successful prosecution of organized crime in Italian history. Rina's calculation was that killing the men who led the fight would demoralize the institutions behind them. The calculation was catastrophically wrong. The assassinations produced a national mobilization against the mafia that exceeded anything in Italian history. Emergency legislation was enacted. Military units were deployed to Sicily. Informants who had remained silent for decades began cooperating. The state response that followed the Falcone and Borsellino killings dismantled the Corleonese leadership within 2 years and imposed a legal and operational framework that permanently reduced the Sicilian mafia's ability to operate with the impunity it had enjoyed for generations. The war against the state was the most consequential strategic error in the modern history of organized crime. The organization that had survived everything the Italian state had previously attempted destroyed itself by provoking a response its leadership had believed was impossible. 12. The Jalisco-Sinaloa War has killed tens of thousands and shows no sign of ending. The conflict between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel represents the largest active organized crime war on the planet. It is not a historical event. It is an ongoing operational reality that has produced a death toll measured not in hundreds but in tens of thousands since its escalation in the mid-2000s. Mexican government statistics recorded over 30,000 homicides annually in recent years, or a significant and increasing proportion of which are attributable to cartel-related violence. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known by its Spanish initials CJNG, emerged from the remnants of the Milenio Cartel and rose under the leadership of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, to challenge Sinaloa's dominance of Mexico's drug trafficking routes. The CJNG's operational methods were distinguished by a willingness to engage Mexican military and law enforcement forces directly, including the use of armored vehicles, military-grade weaponry, and coordinated multi-point attacks on government installations. The war has been fought across multiple Mexican states, with particular intensity in Jalisco, Guanajuato, Michoacán, and Zacatecas. The violence has included mass killings, the public display of dismembered bodies as territorial messaging, and attacks on civilian infrastructure. The scale of the conflict has overwhelmed local and state law enforcement in multiple jurisdictions and produced a humanitarian crisis in communities caught between the competing organizations. Neither cartel has achieved decisive territorial control. The Sinaloa cartel itself fractured following the extradition and conviction of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán in 2019, with internal factions competing for control of the organization's routes and resources while simultaneously fighting the CJNG. The resulting multi-sided conflict has made the Mexican drug war the deadliest organized crime conflict in modern history by an order of magnitude that renders comparisons with prior mafia wars almost meaningless. 13. The Great 'Ndrangheta War of the 1970s established the Calabrian Mafia as Italy's dominant criminal force. Before the 1970s, the 'Ndrangheta was regarded by Italian law enforcement as a provincial organization of limited sophistication, confined to the rural communities of Calabria, and operating primarily through kidnapping and local extortion. The First 'Ndrangheta War of Reggio Calabria, fought between 1974 and 1976 in the context of the broader social unrest that gripped southern Italy during during that period transformed the organization into something fundamentally different. The conflict was fought between the De Stefano and Tripodi Imerti clans for control of Reggio Calabria's criminal economy, which had expanded dramatically following the Italian government's investment in southern infrastructure projects, construction contracts, public works spending, and the economic development programs intended to modernize Calabria had created revenue streams that dwarfed the traditional kidnapping economy. Control of those streams was worth killing for, and both sides killed extensively. The war produced over 200 deaths across its most active period and resulted in the De Stefano faction achieving operational dominance in the Reggio Calabria area. More significantly, the war forced the 'Ndrangheta to develop organizational structures, financial networks, and political connections that it had not previously possessed. The demands of sustained conflict required sophistication. The clans that survived the war emerged with capabilities that allowed them to expand beyond Calabria into northern Italy, into Western Europe, and eventually into South America, Australia, and Canada. By the 2000s, the 'Ndrangheta had become, by multiple law enforcement assessments, the wealthiest and most powerful criminal organization in Italy, surpassing both the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the Neapolitan Camorra. That transformation began in the violence of the 1970s, when a provincial organization was forced by the pressures of internal war to become something its founders would not have recognized. 14. The Cutolo Wars in Naples created a generation of child soldiers. Raffaele Cutolo built the Nuova Camorra Organizzata from inside prison, recruiting thousands of members from the impoverished neighborhoods of Naples and the surrounding Campania region during the late 1970s. His organization was hierarchical in a way that the traditional Camorra clans were not, modeled explicitly on the structure of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, and it grew with a speed that alarmed both rival clans and Italian law enforcement. The rival coalition that formed to oppose Cutolo, the Nuova Famiglia, was composed of established Camorra clans who viewed his expansion as an existential threat to their territorial control. The war between the two organizations, fought primarily between 1980 and 1983, killed an estimated 400 people in the Naples metropolitan area alone. What distinguished the Cutolo Wars from other organized crime conflicts was the age of the combatants. Cutolo had deliberately recruited from Naples's vast population of unemployed and marginalized young men, many of them teenagers. The Nuova Famiglia clans responded in kind. The result was a conflict in which a significant proportion of both the killers and the killed were under 20 years old. Italian sociologists and criminologists who studied the conflict documented a generation of young men in the Secondigliano, Scampia, and Spanish Quarters neighborhoods for whom armed violence had become a normalized component of daily life before they reached adulthood. The war ended with Cutolo's organizational defeat. The Nuova Famiglia coalition dismantled his network through a combination of targeted killings and the cooperation of defectors who provided law enforcement with the intelligence necessary for mass arrests. Cutolo himself, already imprisoned, was subjected to increasingly restrictive confinement conditions and died in prison in February 2021, having spent the majority of his life behind bars. The organizational structure he built was destroyed. The generation he recruited was not. The young men who had been trained in violence during the Cutolo Wars formed the cadre from which subsequent Camorra clans drew their soldiers for the next 2 decades. The war ended. Its consequences did not. 15. The Spamara-Corleonesi conflict erased an entire faction from the map of Sicily. Before Salvatore Rina's Corleonesi faction achieved total dominance of the Sicilian Mafia, they had to eliminate the Spamara clan, a powerful Palermo-based family that had controlled significant territory in the city and maintained alliances across western Sicily. The conflict between the two groups, which played out within the broader context of the Second Mafia War, was one of the most complete campaigns of organizational annihilation in the history of Italian organized crime. The Spamara leadership had allied with the losing side, backing the coalition of traditional Palermo bosses who opposed Corleonesi expansion. That decision, once the Corleonesi began their systematic campaign of elimination, proved fatal in the most literal sense. Rina did not defeat the Spamara faction. He erased it. Members of the Spamara clan were killed sequentially across a period of months. Associates were targeted. Relatives were not exempted. The Corleonesi applied the same methodology to the Spamara that they applied to every opposing faction during the Second Mafia War, a comprehensive elimination designed to ensure that no surviving member retained the capacity or the will to reorganize. By the time the killing killing subsided, the Spamara clan had ceased to exist as an operational entity. Its territories were absorbed. Its surviving members had either fled, cooperated with authorities, or accepted subordinate positions within the Corleonese structure. The faction that had controlled parts of Palermo for decades had been removed from the organizational map of the Sicilian Mafia as completely as if it had never existed. The Spamara-Corleonese conflict represented the logical endpoint of the philosophy that governed every war on this list. When criminal organizations fight, they do not fight for concessions or terms. They fight for elimination. The Corleonese understood this more clearly than any organization in the modern history of organized crime, and they applied that understanding with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about the outcome. Every war on this list began with a calculation. Someone decided that the cost of fighting was less than the cost of accepting the status quo. That calculation was sometimes correct in the short term. It was almost never correct in the long term. The organizations that won their wars emerged weaker than they had been before the fighting began. Their ranks were depleted. Their operational security was compromised by the attention the violence attracted. Their membership was penetrated by informants who chose cooperation over the certainty of death. And the law enforcement agencies tasked with monitoring them had been provided through the wars themselves with exactly the evidence they needed to prosecute. The men who started these wars believed they were building something, consolidating power, eliminating rivals, securing territory. What they were building, in almost every case, was the evidentiary foundation for their own destruction. The violence that was supposed to make them stronger made them visible. And visibility, in their world, was the one thing none of them could afford. That is what every mafia war has in common. Not the killing, the cost.